Our next program this morning is the Open University.
Hello class, I haven't talked to you about one quite important aspect of my creative life in the last 15 years or so, which is writing books. Here's a little Muji bookshelf, two Muji bookends put together, and that's my books. It's not all of the editions. I could have boasted and sort of put some more editions on there. But I wanted to talk about this sort of side career which has become more central, but which was always secretly central in my existence as Momus. And I wanted to read a little bit from Niche here. We have ghostly narrators telling my life story, and towards the end we get Frank Kermode, who says, in November 2004, N compiled a list of his objections to literature. 1. He disliked the sensory deprivation element of reading, the lack of colour, sound, texture, shape and motion. 2. He disliked the sense that literature was something for an elite bourgeois class, usually university educated like himself. 3. He thought that studying the literary canon had made him massively self-conscious about any act of reading, and he didn't like that. 4. He was usually living in some country where the bookshops stocked products he couldn't read. 5. He thought of literature as a moribund art form. 6. He had issues with language as an art medium. Prose, which appeared to be close to reality, was in fact merely close to conventions and assumptions about reality. Unlike poetry, it rarely had the power to startle. 7. The kind of writing that foregrounded the limits of language and explored the very autism N was describing, the literature of exhaustion, inverted commas, seemed to him tremendously depressing. And 8. He thought that writers dressed badly. So he described this position as post-literary, but perhaps it would be more accurate to call it a self-consciously anti-literary stance. He had studied literature, but his taste had come to contain a self-critique, a critique of himself as a literary person and of the bourgeois class he had emerged from. But then Kermode goes on to say that literature had been secretly a kind of religion for me. Of course, he's my porte-parole there, he's my spokesperson. These were my own objections to literature, and it's an interesting conflict which has been played out through the course of my 6 decades. So I guess I come from a very literary family. My dad spent most of his life teaching English as a foreign language, so the language was central. My mother has been a librarian most of her life, special collections at Edinburgh University Library, for instance, for a long time. When she met my dad, she was a librarian at Glasgow University Library, so they moved from the west to the east of Scotland. And my first experiences growing up were of these flats of theirs, which were obviously stuffed with books, and which I used to play with. The books were my sort of bricks, my Lego bricks, my sort of toys. I would push them in and make sort of lines and curves and sweeps on through the bookshelves. It's one reason I'm always appearing, like everybody these days, in front of my bookshelves, is that I love to touch them and I love to be around books. Even if I can't read them and understand them, a lot of the books I have in my shelves here are in languages I still don't speak very well, if at all. So I do like them as objects, and I've always had them around. And I come from a literary family, and this word bourgeois does keep cropping up because it seems to me to be one of the defining characteristics of a particular class, that we are bookish, we're educated. We're not rich people at all, but we've been educated people. And we based our special sense of self on this, the fact that we had university degrees in English literature. Both my parents and myself have degrees in literature. Well, my dad, anyway, had a degree in English literature, which he then went on to do postgrad work in linguistics on the base of. And that's how I got first published. The amazing thing is that I was published as a writer even before I was making songs, because I was sort of an infant prodigy in the sense of making my first song at the age of 7, I Can See Japan. I had a whole EP's worth of songs which were kind of ripping off The Who and the Beatles and people. because I became aware of pop music really in 67. But actually in 64, I published my first short story in a Longman's linguistics textbook, which my dad put together, and which is just a little story he recorded onto his tape recorder of me talking about a fire engine going through the streets of Edinburgh with its bell ringing, dingling, and a dog gets killed by a bell bouncing on the roof of a building. It's kind of a surreal narrative. So it gets recounted in niche as a tape recorder story by William Burroughs, who himself was experimenting with tape recorder narratives at that time. That same year, in fact, he published a novel based on tape recordings he'd made. So it started very early. I guess in some ways it was no big deal to be published at the age of 4. You know, to me it just seemed normal. I guess it wasn't. But it then took me another 50 years to sort of get back into print, because although I went to university and studied literature, which was a family tradition really. It was partly because I wasn't any good at anything else. I mean, I was bottom in all my classes except for English, and I was top in English. And so I knew that I could sort of fool people with my ability to express myself and to analyze literature. And that's what I did. I mean, I treated university as 4 years to read books and lounge about and be a poser, read the music press and start getting interested in music. See, music to me was an escape because it didn't seem so respectable. I felt kind of intellectually self-conscious about literature because I was studying it. But also I felt that it was terribly respectable. It was this canon. Since we're talking about Frank Kermode, using Frank Kermode, his name is synonymous. He's the critic who talks about the canon. Little did I know that rock music, which would be my escape from the literary canon, would itself turn into a canonical art form. Now all I see on social media is people putting their canonical listicles, you know, their favorite, greatest all-time ever albums. And to me that's a very sad phenomenon. I'm sorry all those people out there who are doing that, but really, as soon as you start to sclerose your choices and your preferences into a sort of canon in that way, it starts to become a boring and dead art form, like a classical art form full of repertory performances, almost rote performances of acknowledged masterpieces. There's a great little essay by Antonin Artaud called No More Masterpieces. A bit like the Stranglers when they came along and said no more heroes, just when David Bowie had heroes in the charts, and David Bowie had to hastily put inverted commas around heroes to show that he wasn't being serious about the idea of heroism. No More Heroes actually charted higher than Heroes did. That was the funny thing. That was the feeling of the time. And Bowie himself even kind of denigrated Heroes by making a track 10 years later called Zeros. Tonight the Zeros were playing for you. Anyway, that's a sidetrack. Have to always have my little Bowie sidetrack in these narratives. So it seemed too respectable, and I was so respectful, and also I was sort of specialized in the 20th century literature of exhaustion, which again was mentioned in that Kermode piece. I was reading people like Al Alvarez, who talked about suicide and about literary blocks. I was reading so many pieces in literary magazines about how writers were blocked, or how literature itself was blocked, and there was this thing called the literature of exhaustion. Samuel Beckett was a big hero of mine, and he was very much central to the literature of exhaustion. Nothing with which to say, and still the necessity to say it. I can't go on, I'll go on. All that stuff which sort of seems to be cancelling itself out, and which is a kind of literary form of modernist minimalism, because he's trying to reduce everything to a kind of zero of the spirit, a kind of zero of morale, to create and yet to say as little as possible, and yet to say everything at the same time. So, I was very much taken by that. I believed all those writers who said that they had nothing to say and who couldn't, who were blocked, who were too depressed to write, who were suicidal, who cancelled themselves out. A lot of Japanese authors cancelled themselves out socially because to write was shameful. To expose your inner failings and quirks and qualms and things was in itself inherently shameful. But I was interested in what was shameful, and I was drawn to people like Bataille as well, precisely for the exposure of that which is shameful, because there seemed to be a kind of very intimate relationship between the writer and the reader, that there weren't many people reading a lot of these confessional type books, but that when you did get into someone, when you found a voice that really resonated with you, I would say Denton Welsh is a good example. More recently for me, of someone who really resonates. A kind of queer writer, very English and very queer, and I'm Scottish and straight, but nevertheless something in him really resonates with me, and I feel that there's a secret bond between us. I almost don't want to tell you about him because there's such a powerful relationship I have with him one-to-one, you know. So I always really liked that kind of outsider literature or kind of transgressive literature. But I didn't think I could ever get published as a result of all this kind of depressing stuff. Writers, in every single interview they gave, they said, listen, if you don't absolutely need to be a writer, don't even bother, because you're going to be rebuffed at every stage, you're not going to get published, you're going to have drawers full of unpublished books. None of which turned out to be true at all for me. I found publishers beating a path to my door despite the fact that I'd expressed zero interest in publishing any books. It's very, very strange the way it's happened. And also, when it came down to the process of creating text, you know, as someone said, writers don't make books, they make texts. So when it came to creating texts, in my 50s, when I did start making books, I found it was really easy. You just sit down and you write 1,000 words every day, and after 25 days you've got a novella. So I wrote a lot of novellas, which basically took me 3 months each. You know, not much longer than an album. When I first started getting contracts for making indie records, I thought that would be a way to sneakily be making books that were actually musical forms of a book, so like talking books. So the Happy Family concept album, you know, for instance, was a way to freight a musical product with kind of literary ambitions. Probably kind of failed on all levels because the audience, the consumers of that kind of plastic disc, don't want books. If they wanted books, they'd go to a bookshop and buy books, you know. And many of them did, of course. But for me, it was a way to get a contract of some kind to express myself in some way. And I liked the kind of vivacity of, you know, the illusion of hearing someone's voice rather than reading something off a page. I'm always slightly uncomfortable reading because I can't really hold my body still that long, and my eyes start to look a bit, I start to see little funny specks on my eyes and stuff like that if I'm reading. And it feels like a withdrawal, a sensory deprivation. So yeah, I made all these albums which were kind of literary and obviously very much influenced by writers, you know, Mishima Joe Orton, Celine, endless Kafka, obviously, endless literary influences. So it seemed like I was taking content from one medium and putting it into another. And that if I'd been a writer inspired by all those 20th century kind of things, I would have been very belated and sort of unoriginal writer. But being a singer, I could somehow make those things fresh again by putting them into a new container, a new egg carton. Old eggs in a new carton. So that's what I did, and it didn't really cartonner, as the French put it. It wasn't really commercially successful, but it was sort of a happy experience for me, and I've really enjoyed making music more than anything else. That is really where I feel my vocation kicks in, where I really just, you know, when a rabbit runs through some sandy hills and with trees and, you know, leaping in the air with happiness. That's me in songs. Me in music is kind of that rabbit. But writing has been a really interesting sideline. And of course I've got a book coming out, my memoir coming out in 2 months, a couple of months' time from now. But let's go through chronologically, see how this career, which never really was supposed to be, and yet was also kind of fated at the same time. Let's see where it began. It began with this book, The Book of Jokes, and I have to mention my long-term editor, Jeremy M. Davies, who's a writer in his own right. Check out his books, very excellent short stories and novels. Great novel about the Earl of Rochester, the obscene poet. He's obviously interested in the obscene, which I am too. I'm going to turn this light on just for the hell of it. This is The Book of Jokes, and it's a novel by Momus. I'm using the same artist name in the books as I do in the records. And this was almost crowdsourced because I thought, well, I want to write a novel. I was initially approached by Xavier Belrose to write this not in French, but to write it in English for a French publisher, La Volte. So that was the origin of it. It wasn't Jeremy Davies picked it up for Dalkey Archive Press in Chicago It became part of their British literature series. And actually one of the more interesting reviews said that it was, the reviewer had just seen this as a sort of unnecessary pile of filth until they realised that it was part of a Celtic, Irish-Scottish tradition of rebellion and resistance against the English imperial project. I thought that was quite funny and quite apt, actually. It is kind of, I think there is definitely a Celtic rebel in me, and that my obscenity, apart from not wanting to be too bourgeois and respectable, which has always been a major impulse, because I am bourgeois and respectable, well, sort of, not that respectable really, but I really wanted to make a very obscene book. And this is pretty much as obscene as I could make it. It's been compared to The Naked Lunch and all the rest of it. But it was a way to get an equivalent in literature of the kind of unacceptability of rock music, of pop music, the fact that pop is an inherently unrespectable and unestablished form. At least it was when I started making it. It became, unfortunately, very central in culture and very established and very conservative as a result of that. But I always tried to make a radical and challenging and obscene. It had to be beyond the pale, whatever I did. I felt that was essential. I don't know why. Why did I have to be beyond the pale? It was partly embarrassment about having bourgeois origins myself and being overeducated and all the rest of it. Agitated, organised and overeducated. But also it was because, that's the most fun literature there's ever been. It's Rabelais and it's Boccaccio and all those people who are kind of naughty. That is the most fun thing you can do when you're sitting down alone to write and to have this kind of whispery, intimate connection with somebody. It's kind of nice to whisper dubious and obscene things if you're going to have that intimate relationship with another person. Impersonal and yet highly personal at the same time. So anyway, one interesting thing about my books is I totally forget what I've said in them, and I can read them as if they're by someone else. Not that I go back and read them enormously, but let's just read something at random here to see if I can even remember what's happening. Chapter 18. After we'd escaped, just before we went to commit the crimes that we'd been falsely accused of, the murderer, the molester, and I spent a few hours bird watching at Inner Forest. Well, I mean that. First of all, it's quite interesting that they're described. They're the murderer and the molester, and I guess this is Sebastian Skeleton, who's the father of the narrator. It's a bit confusing because every second chapter is narrated by a different generation. You get the son and the father alternately describing events. And you so you have the murderer and the molester who have actually been falsely imprisoned and then they escape. And in order to settle society's debt to them, they decide they have the right to commit the crimes they were falsely accused of, so that society at least is put in the right belatedly. It's kind of the reverse of the... This is a conceit I love, is the world turned upside down. It's the ass rides the man instead of the man riding the ass. It's Brechtian in a sense. There's, McKeith or whatever is amoral because he has his own kind of moral universe in which what he does is right. That kind of idea. Or that the Herr Puntilla is only humane when he's drunk. This kind of idea, very Brechtian. So the murderer and the molester become murderers and molesters only belatedly because society has punished them for having supposedly been that. But also, what's interesting in that first paragraph of chapter 18 is that they're bird watching at Inner Forest, which is a reference to a Cornelius track, which in turn is a reference to, a Hosono novel or something. Cornelius obviously took that from somewhere else. And it's the way I work. I would have sat down that day thinking about that Cornelius track and just put it in as an obscure, untraceable, semi-untraceable reference in the book, just for the hell of it. Inner Forest was the wood next to the glass house. I knew that it contained a family of greater crested grebes. I knew this because in prison I had subscribed to a bird-watching newsletter which reported that hatchlings had been spotted riding on their mother's back as she scrabbled across the gravel pit in the forest clearing. This was a notable event indeed. Greater crested grebes hadn't been seen at Inner Forest in over a century. This reminds me a bit of early Peter Greenaway kind of scripts that he would make artworks around or films around. It's sort of that very playful 70s Tom Phillips, Eno, and Peter Greenaway were at that, and Michael Nyman at that point were a little artistic group in and unto themselves, making this kind of postmodern narrative, or non-narrative in Eno's case. And you can see that I'm sort of in, at least I can, the first thing I see there is, okay, Shibuya-kei, late 70s, post-minimalism, and a kind of incorporation of random elements. But I mean, there is a kind of an overarching moral point in the Book of Jokes, which is that, and it's about the kind of things Burroughs wrote about, control, how we are controlled and conditioned by behavioral systems, which are massive and global. And in this case, it's a family and the control is sort of arbitrary, that they've been condemned to live out their lives in terms of a cosmic joke, a huge joke which they are the brunt of, they're the scapegoat in the joke, they're the punchline. And all they can do to escape this conditioning is retell the jokes in their own way, slow them down. So what I have fun doing in this book is slowing down a lot of jokes, dirty jokes and old jokes and new jokes, and retelling them in such a way that they become, just like when you slow down a Rick Astley track, if you slow it down sufficiently, it becomes an avant-garde piece of music. So if you slow down jokes, somehow the punchline takes longer to arrive, the punchline being ultimately death, the ultimate determination of our lives. The script we are given, which we have no choice over, can be altered with some edits. So that's really the idea of this, that you can go into these jokes and kind of try and mess them up enough, chop them up, edit them around, change the order, change the context, and of course they keep coming back to kind of hit you again and again. But you can take some of the power out of the punch, of the punchline. That's really the overarching moral thought in this, and it's about overcoming conditioning, control, socialization. And I have a lot of fun along the way telling those jokes. It is a funny book. It genuinely is quite frighteningly funny. And it's very playful. I think all my books are kind of playful in that way. Surprisingly enough, it wasn't really a big sales hit, but it did get a lot of translations. Obviously in French, because it was commissioned by a French publisher. That's the La Volte edition. This is the Spanish edition, El Libro de las Bromas. I don't think it sold very much. In fact, it probably put its publisher out of business. But it was going to be in German as well, but the Blumenbar, who were going to put it out, changed their minds at the last minute. We even had a cover and everything waiting to go. So after that, there's a kind of spate of books about countries. And this is, it starts with the Book of Scotland. So that's the second edition, the Scottish edition. That's the first edition, Sternberg. Ingo Neerman commissioned these. Again, none of these were written on spec. These were books which were written on commission for publishers. So I found that's the way to make books, is to wait until publishers say, hey, listen, give us a book. And then it's going to come out. You have to sit down and commit to it. And that work, whether it's 3 months or 6 months or whatever, will not have been wasted, because it will actually appear and it will actually change your status in the world somehow. So these books about countries, it's weird because I never really write about character, I never really write about plot, family structures, and I mean, obviously there's a lot of incest jokes in the Book of Jokes. There is family in that sense, but the main character in my books for the next decade essentially became nations. And so it starts with Scotland, because Scotland was about to have this independence referendum, and I thought, let's have some delirious speculation about what the future of Scotland might be. As a Scot, it's important to me to think about the future of my nation and whether it could have a special destiny if it were independent. I'm very, again, going back to the Celtic rebel kind of spirit, I am very resentful of English domination of Scotland, and I think England has become an appalling country, just an awful country. It's really a ball and chain, literally tethered to Scotland's hind parts at the moment. So Scotland really needs to shake that off, chop off that chain with chain cutters. So I'm very much into independence as an eventual destination for Scotland, and this was a way to just tell people, think about the future of Scotland. Don't think in these boring pragmatic political terms, think in delirious speculations, think feverishly about the future of Scotland. Let's imagine, any exercise, no matter how ridiculous, in imagining the future of Scotland is a way to build some kind of future, not necessarily any of the futures that are described in here. Let's look at one at random. Scotland 90, the Scotland in which human voices wake us and we drown. That's a reference to The Tempest, isn't it? I think it's The Tempest. Scotland 91, the Scotland in which roads are overgrown with vegetation and people hike along public footpaths. That's an anti-car Scotland. Scotland 131, the Scotland in which forests move about fulfilling an ancient prophecy. That's obviously Dunsinane, all that stuff from Macbeth, the Scottish play. The references are not that hard to track down, to sleuth out. But this was important for me to kind of, as a palate cleanser, I suppose, in that it's not obscene, like the Book of Jokes was. And some of the reviewers, like Pat Kane in the Scottish Review of Books, were relieved, obviously, that I had escaped my compulsion to be obscene. So they gave this good reviews and called it generous and all the rest of it, compassionate and imaginative. And obviously, the precedent for this is Calvino. It's more the influence from Italo Calvino. And one of the Scotlands, I imagine, is a Scotland with 400 years of influence from Calvino rather than from John Calvin. And this kind of continues with the same editor, Ingo Nierman, in the Book of Japans, which comes out in 2011. So we're talking about 2008 for the Book of Jokes, 2009 for the Book of Scotland's, 2011 for the Book of Japan's. This one is, if the Book of Scotland's is kind of like fragments and short stories, this is a continuous novel in which I describe some idiots in the Shetland Isles who claim to have seen the future of Japan by going through time, using cows in calf as a time machine. So the cow delivers its calf and then the idiots crawl inside the cow, and this acts as a time machine somehow, and they get transported to the future of Japan, and they come back with messages and glimpses of that future. And many of these are accurate, like including predicting the exact date of an earthquake. So some experts get flown out to Shetland to quiz these idiots about the future of Japan, to see if there's really something in this. Ridiculous kind of scenario, but it was fun to write. And I'd just been to Shetland, the Shetland Isles, and I have some family ancestral connections to the Shetland Isles as well. I've been there with my mother to sort of research our roots a little bit. And Japan and the Shetlands, you couldn't really find anything less similar, but I like connecting unlikely things. And it was also a way of satirizing the phenomenon of the Japan expert, who, a bit like the futurologist in general, is someone who describes something unknowable, essentially unknowable. People in the West don't really understand Japan, even if they've been there. I think it's very difficult to understand because it's the most different culture. It's an advanced, rich technological culture, but which does things in a very different way to America, for instance, which is the dominant template still for civilization in our time. So that's why Japan fascinates me. It's not a backward, it's not Easter Island, it's not a sort of tribal culture that's somehow survived in the jungle undisturbed. It's a modern technological civilization which nevertheless operates on some very fundamentally different principles, including communitarianism, collectivism, team spirit, all that stuff. Conformism, if you like to look at the negative side of it. And we have this quote on the back of this: "We have no great and clear idea of another world," says Alain Badiou. So it's really just saying, let's have maybe an unclear idea of some other worlds, some ridiculous ideas of other worlds. Again, speculative, delirious politics, but using the tool of surrealism, essentially, or Dada, or collage, or the random. So let's randomly pick a little bit here. I'm scrawling notes passive-aggressively. I will consider this a learning experience, not about Japan, but about cynicism. Moronic cynicism is a form of naivete. It's naivete turned inside out, naivete with a sneer. So this is the experts questioning the idiots. And so, of course, it's epistemology. You have to call this epistemology and invoke Gadamer and people like that. That it's about how we know what we know, and whether we whether knowledge can be interrogated and what happens when you interrogate knowledge, and whether there are esoteric forms of knowledge which actually might be as useful as the established academic forms of knowledge. So using a nation, or supposedly talking about a nation, but actually talking about how you think about anything really, especially things which are difficult to measure. So you can't really measure Japan's difference from the rest of the world, and you can't really measure what the future will be like. There is no definitive version of the future. There is no, way of... Anyway, this is another... Herr F. is another nation book, essentially, because it's about Germany, about Germanness, and it's written for a German... Again, Ingo Nierman, the editor who commissioned it, he had moved on from Sternberg. The first two, the Japans and Scotland books, are in Sternberg, published by Sternberg, a Berlin-based art publisher. And this was a project for fiction in Berlin, although this paper edition comes out thanks to Taberna Critica, which is a publisher in Switzerland. So it's very much my way of thinking about Germanness, pastiching Germanness. And it's also about the ultimate German myth, which is Faust. Goethe wrote, of course, Faust, but it's also Dr. Faustus, the idea of knowledge corrupting, or knowledge being a temptation, the desire to better oneself through a kind of esoteric knowledge, pacts with the devil. This is the German edition, the German translation of Herr F. But, and I don't know, Das Buch von Moos ist bei Sorkamp erschienen, says chapter 19, the Book of Moss. So the idea is, the plot is that the devil comes to this writer, this character who wants to have huge success, and says, okay, you can have huge success, you can write whatever you want, and it'll be a multi-billion bestseller. So he writes this book called the Book of Moss, the most boring book ever about moss. Actually, I subscribed to a Facebook group about mosses and lichens, and I don't think they're boring. I think it's a very interesting topic. Moss gardens, what could be more beautiful? David Bowie even wrote a song about moss gardens next to his song about Neukölln. Here I am living in Neukölln. I should have a moss garden in the garden. But so yeah, he writes this Book of Moss, and he gets his ideal girl in there's even a postcard, marketing. In the original Faust, it's Helen of Troy that Faustus gets as his partner, because he can have any woman, and this woman has inspired the Trojan Wars. She's with her beauty. So, in my version, it's someone called Gretchen Mitsukoshi, who's the prize for Faustus, and he sold his eternal soul for worldly success. And the action moves through Spain, and he ends up building a house on top of the Matterhorn, which is ruined by tourists and mountaineers and hikers coming to the top of the Matterhorn to look at his Thomas Zumthor house, architect-designed house. So it's about whether a huge success can really help you escape from the herd, whether it's really a curse or a blessing. But it's about essentially about Germanness. So Germany is the main character. And the next book I write is also about a country as a character. It's called Un-America. There are two different covers on Un-America, the blue one, both by me, and both a parody of Fontana Modern Masters, which I admire a lot. Sort of 70s systematic version where you could actually build up a collection of these paperbacks, Collins, Fontana paperbacks about thinkers, modern thinkers. I love those sort of Bluffer's Guide to Modern Culture type things that students read. So I wanted to make these look like that. But it's really about, it says on the back, God doesn't love America, quite the reverse. So it's about the idea that America has become a machine for creating unpleasant humans, which, if it was true at the time, is doubly true now, unfortunately. Trump's America seems to be a very efficient machine. In fact, it seems to be their only export industry that's really succeeding right now, is the creation of utterly obnoxious individuals who want to drive their SUVs straight through hospital orderly cordons, and people trying to tell them to put masks on and ignoring it and all the rest of it. Just really, or torturing immigrant children, whatever. So, Un-America, which has appeared in French as well, came out again. Xavier Belrose, the original editor, commissioned the Book of Jokes. It has an imprint called Serpent à Plume, and so God. It says on the back of this, God, who's a janitor at a fast food concern in South Carolina, is showing the signs of Alzheimer's disease. Looking back at his works, God wants. He sees that everything is good except America, so he wants America to be uninvented. So it ends up like an epic sea voyage, a sea journey to uninvent America, to sort of erase the Vikings' discovery, or Irish, according to some people, it was Irish monks who discovered America, in the name of God, back in the 13th, I don't know, the 12th century, the 11th century, something like that. So God wants that voyage to be retraced. So a longboat sets off from America back to Ireland to sort of reverse the whole process. Again, a silly kind of idea for a book, but it becomes, I kind of like the way it turns. It's all about preparations for the voyage in South Carolina, and but then towards the end we get the voyage itself, and it becomes very strange. It's kind of like Kafka's America in reverse. Un-America, Kafka's America, America as the promised disappointment. The sort of hell on earth which we need to disown at this point in history. So it is an anti-American book, I would have to say. Culturally it's anti-American. But again, it continues this idea of the nation as a character. And I kind of ran out of nations. I think Ingo's even asked me to make a new book for the original Sternberg Solution series about a new country, make a third title. I don't know which country I would be able to write about after Scotland and Japan, and then dealing with America and Germany. Then there is a book which didn't appear on paper. This is standing in for it, because the pastiche cover on my website is based on a Surkamp about this vintage, and it's called Pop-Up. Probably the slightest of all the novellas. And it's inspired by the story of a John Cantley, who was a motorcycle journalist in Britain, and somehow got mixed up in Syria with the insurgency, and got captured by Daesh, and had to do propaganda broadcasts for the Caliphate, because they got quite a sophisticated and slick media organization with television and magazine publishing and everything on behalf of the so-called Caliphate. So the idea was to get Western journalists involved as well. And so this guy, shouldn't laugh, I think he's dead now, pretty sure, because we've not heard from him since about 3-4 years. But yeah, John Cantley, as an Englishman and as a sort of consumer journalist of a very recognizable type, it kind of fascinated me, the idea that he would be captured and made to do this propaganda. In a sense, we are all working for toxic causes in one way or another. If we're commercial creatives, we tend to have to work for money, and we have to work for people who are ultimately toxic. If you trace that money back far enough, you will find some toxic corruption of some kind, and so it's not that different from any kind of creative, any kind of journalist, any kind of graphic designer. In my case, it's John Cantley becomes 2 graphic designers who've been captured, and they keep escaping, and they keep trying to cross borders and get out of Syria into Turkey and stuff, but not quite succeeding. And their job is to make the beheadings, look good, have the right typeface. There's a lot of comedy of the incongruity of dealing with aesthetic choices of how you present. What kind of typeface do you use on the video of a beheading, for instance? Grim satirical humor like that. But it struck me as just quite a useful symbol of the dilemma of the creative who, even if you're an artist, making decorative artworks which the super rich are buying to put on their walls, I have a lot of sympathy for people who just work with color, beautiful colors. And actually, Ettore Sottsass is another key influence on that book. The idea, it was me trying to sort of thrash out in my mind how I felt about pure aesthetic responses to the world. If you bracket your moral concerns and your sort of satirical concerns and all the rest of it, and just make art, because I spend a lot of time globe-trotting, looking at art exhibitions, looking at biennials, triennials, whatever, and responding to it, but at the same time feeling a sense of, who is this for? Is this just sort of window dressing for the super rich? So it's not just about John Cantley, it's not just about journalists working for toxic car corporations or whatever, or political organizations in the Middle East. It's about whether we can escape, whether it's right to escape politics into a sort of aesthetics. And then after that, because it didn't really even get reviews, it was very little read, and I was a bit discouraged by the reception of Pop-Up, because there was a sort of Venn diagram of the people interested in aesthetics and the people interested in politics, and also that you have to remember that Marquis Smith is a key. Marquis Smith is a prophet in this book, and before he died, I was sort of scanning Fall websites and looking at the way people parsed Fall songs for their inner meanings and teased out the kind of cultural references from Fall songs. And I thought that Marquis Smith, with his kind of slightly toxic character, would make a very good head of a religion. So in fact, the religion that these graphic designers are working for, this very intolerant Middle Eastern religion, claims Marquis Smith as one of its main prophets. Marquis Smith is kind of oblivious to this, and when somebody phones him up, one of the characters phones him up, he just sort of says, "Oh, I'm proud of my band, and whatever the fans do is not my responsibility." But so the Venn diagram of people who know about the Fall lyrics and people who know about the Tory Sotsas and people who care about what's happening in Syria, there is really no overlap. Such a tiny overlap between those circles. There's really only me and 3 other people in that overlap. So it was destined to miss all its targets, I guess, and to be niche, which brings us on to the last book I've written, which is the longest by far. It's 4 of those novellas would fit in this. It's over 100,000 words. But it was easy to write again because it's the story of my life, and I know what's happened in my life, and I was able to play some of the same games that I played in the other books with this. It was going to be a book about drugs when it was commissioned by Jeremy Davis. I came back from Asia to Europe, and I had lunch. One of the first things I did, I went to Paris and got a new girlfriend. That was the first thing I did, Noemi. And then I had this lunch with Jeremy Davis in Berlin. He was over for some literary conference or something. And he just casually said, "Why don't you write a book for Farrar, Straus and Giroux? Why don't you write a memoir?" So I didn't really take him seriously. I thought he was kind of just being polite. But then he followed up with several emails and offered money, and the original idea was that it was going to be a book about drugs. Ha ha ha, I've never taken any drugs. But, the parody of the typical musician's my struggle with drugs, Elton fucking John, whatever. Please have sympathy with me because I put all your money that you spent on my records up my nose. Poor old me. Pathetic. But I thought, why don't we make a parody of that? But it lasted, 3 pages, and then it got boring. What was interesting to me was to take the voices of dead writers, force them, a bit actually like Pop-Up, because these graphic designers are forced to make this regime in Syria look good. The Marquis Smith-inspired regime. So I thought, why don't I force dead writers who have this enormous moral authority and dignity and are canonical, Let's, again, play with the canon by making them look a bit foolish or getting them very angry, like Norman Mailer says, "It's fucking nobody, why do we somebodies have to talk about a nobody?" I thought that would be a nice paradox. And to have people who are quite mainstream talking about someone who's very niche, it sort of makes fun of my marginality, but in quite a useful way, because it's otherwise it would be pointless to talk about me at all. I haven't really achieved very much. Why would anybody want to read my life as a kind of failure? It would have been the book would have been called My Life as a Failure or something. But if I say niche already sounds, it's got a lot of different meanings. It sounds like my name. It's your ashes are put in a funerary niche when you're burned, cremated. But also it's a marketing term for something which is actually quite a good and kind of connoisseur product. So that seems to describe Momus Records as well, I think. So it's a history, an oral history modelled a little bit, formally modelled on books like Dylan Jones's Bowie book or the Legs McNeil book about punk, Please Kill Me, which is very readable. They've come from me. You can read these. You can read these books, very quickly because the grain, the texture keeps changing as the voices change. And one really interesting thing about this is that we've sold the rights for an audiobook of Niche. There's a company which does audiobooks, which is committed to making an audio book in which one actor will try and do all the voices. There's 177 narrators in this, so I'm looking forward to hearing. I've actually heard a little snippet, a demo that they did. I was given the choice of actors. One of them had a very silky voice like Robert Vaughan, but sounded the same whatever he read, whereas the other one was trying to do the accents. So we have in the early pages, we have Fred Chanel, who's an Australian educator who taught me to spell. A lot of textbooks and things that he wrote were used in my school. So the guy does an Australian accent for that, and then you have William Burroughs, and he does an American accent for that. And I thought his imitations were actually good. It's very hard. There's no way I could have done this myself. I couldn't have read this book myself. I don't have the acting skills for that. So I'm looking forward. We've got some excellent reviews already, 2 or 3 reviews of this, and both very, very good. It's essentially saying it's both entertaining and a literary triumph, so, or a grand entertainment and well written as well. So I'm very happy already. It'd be interesting also to see bad reviews. I don't mind seeing bad reviews as well. But 217 narrators, not 177. 6 decades. One somewhat obscure Scottish pop star. 6 decades, 217 narrators. So this book writing thing is fun. I don't really have any plans for future titles. I don't know where I would go from here. It might be interesting to try and do a serious literary, novel. Without the playful and humorous stuff, but why would I do that? Why would I bother? Because it's hard enough getting people to read books in the first place. You've got to make them laugh. You've got to give them that little frisson of hearing confessions, perhaps, or things they shouldn't really be hearing. For some reason, my voice is giving out now, so I'm going to leave it there. This was my career as an author, and really the big picture is that there is no literary exhaustion. There is no end of the voice of the storyteller. I think we can keep rattling out stories. It's very easy to tell stories. It's very easy to make people laugh, or to amuse people, or to shock people, or give people that reason to turn the page to find the next joke or the next anecdote, or maybe little poetic insight into something that they hadn't quite thought of in that way before. So it's easy to make books. I would recommend it. It's a lot of fun. It hasn't made me a lot of money, except for this last one, which, because it was a big publisher, had a big advance. Quite a nice tidy sum. But don't do it for money. Do it because you have an inner need, some kind of innate desire to express yourself. That's part of it, obviously, but I don't know. I don't feel like I've expressed myself. It's weird. I feel like I've expressed the world. I feel like I've expressed how I see things. Because when I used to keep diaries, and I publish some of my diaries as well as PDFs on my website, but when I used to keep these very serious arty diaries, that was me expressing myself, and it wasn't terribly interesting, to be honest. I think it's much more interesting to express, to be funny, to be light, to be playful, to be a bit kind of gung-ho and reckless, and unrespectable. That's super important. Still very central for me to be unrespectable. So, as a sort of poet maudit, I have to confess to some crimes and some sins in Niche, and that was essential. Not very big ones. I probably could have confessed more crimes and sins and made myself more unattractive, more roguish, but I didn't want to be Baal. I didn't want to be that sort of toxic kind of poet maudit character, but there is a certain amount of, a few peccadillos discussed in there to keep you turning the pages.
Open University.